do you think? Why don't we get started at 10 after? It's about 2 minutes from now.
Right. So the first thing I want to just throw out a couple of questions for you to keep in mind in terms of how you evaluate any monarch, but also specifically Cleopatra. How well does the monarch handle empires on their doorstep, especially large empires? How do you gain power? How do you stay in power? How do you blend the cultures of your empire to decrease factionalism? And are you building just for the present, or do you plan for the future? So, history of Alexandria. It is founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, and we'll get into the details of that and his life, because he put the imprint on the city, and that imprint really lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. He dies in 323 BC in Baghdad, and the empire splits into three pieces, each of the pieces ruled by one of his generals. Ptolemy ends up as the ruler of Egypt and part of the Near East. And by 305 BC, he proclaims himself Pharaoh. And this is the beginning of the Ptolemaic Empire, which ends with Cleopatra. So it's a dynasty that goes for almost 300 years. Now, the very famous library is founded in 283, and we'll discuss that. And the lighthouse, which is one of the wonders of the ancient world, in 27. And Cleopatra's born in 69. So she's really born at the latter part. She's the last of the Ptolemy pharaohs, and she is a pharaoh, even though she's a woman. After that, the Romans essentially take over Egypt, first with sort of the keeping the pharaoh system going with Cleopatra, and then after her death, they just absorb it as part of the empire. And as we'll see later, one of the things that Cleopatra needs to do is there's a civil war between she and her sister and brother. And Caesar has come into Egypt to sort of establish Roman control. And she wins him over and becomes his lover. And he leans in her direction, and she wins the civil war. So we'll get into that in a bit.
David, you said is her sister's brother. Isn't that her brother then?
What did I say? What,
you said that something about Cleopatra's sister's brother.
No. Cleopatra's sister and brother.
Oh, and brother. Okay.
Yeah, they were on the opposite side of this of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Julius Caesar is assassinated in 44. And Cleopatra aligns herself with Mark Antony. Ultimately, he loses in a fight with Octavian, who later becomes Augustus, and that marks the death of Antony and Cleopatra. So those are sort of the dates to hang yourself, hang the story on, and we'll go over those as we go through the discussion. Now, Alexander the Great, as you know, was a genius. He was educated by Aristotle from the age of 13 on. He was a master military mind, and he was somebody who was sort of interested in all areas of study, whether it's study of philosophy, the study of animals, but primarily he wanted to extend Greek culture beyond Greece. And this was marked a revolution in the history of humanity. It changed history. Without Alexander, the Near East would not have been, and the Mediterranean would not have been what it became. He was the one who spread Greek culture. Now, this is his father, Philip II, and his ambition was to conquer Greece. Greece at that time was set into city-states, and Macedonia was just one area of northern Greece. And Alexander's relationship with his father was problematic. His mother and father did not get along at all. And ultimately, there was a question about whether Philip was going to block Alexander from succeeding him, which didn't happen. Now, this is a famous story of Alexander with his horse Bucephalus. Do you know this story? Anybody? No.
I know the name.
Okay, this just gives you an idea. Pardon?
I said because Rosinante loves Bucephalus.
Well, I mean, this just gives you an idea of how smart this kid was. At the age of 8, his father brought him to a market that sold horses, and they were looking at this stallion. There's a war horse, and the stallion was uncontrollable. Nobody knew how to control the horse, and his father just said, "Well, this is worthless." And Alexander said, "If I can control the horse, will you buy him for me?" And his father said, "Yes." And Alexander had realized that the horse was afraid of his shadow. So he moved the horse so the shadow was directly behind him, and the horse calmed down. And this became Alexander's war horse for the next 20 years. This is Aristotle, his teacher. From the age of 13 on, Aristotle was his instructor. Essentially, his father wanted, Alexander to get the best possible Greek education. Macedonia was considered sort of a backwater at this point. And Aristotle imbued in Alexander a love of learning. And during the time that Alexander was conquering the world, he was constantly sending back examples of the animal life, plants, other kinds of books or whatever he came across that he thought Aristotle might be interested in. So their relationship continued to the end of Alexander's life. This is a depiction of the young Alexander learning from Aristotle. And Aristotle said that educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living to the dead. So obviously, big emphasis on education. Here's an early sculpture of Alexander, and from all the descriptions, he was a extremely good-looking fellow, extremely athletic, fearless in battle. His men, his soldiers, adored him. This is another statue of Alexander that was 3rd century BC. Now, in the time of Philip, I told you that Macedon was one section of Greece, and all the rest of Greece was different city-states. And what Philip did is he conquered all of Greece. Now, it had been the dream of Alexander to conquer the Persian Empire, which was enormous. Here's a picture of the Persian Empire. Now, Persia had tried to conquer Greece 2 times in the 5th century. One, 490, when you had the invasion where you had the Battle of Marathon, and then in 480, where you had the 300 Spartans blocking the pass so that the Greeks could get enough time to amass a fleet that was necessary. Now, when Alexander was young, he would always want to be in the room when people from Persia, diplomats or whatever, would come in, because he would question them in detail about the cities, the roads. And people were saying, wow, it's amazing that he was interested in all this. Well, he already had a plan. he was gathering information for the conquest. Anyway, rather than going into the details of what he did, because he went all the way from Greece to India, let's get into the conquest of Egypt. One of the things that Alexander realized, that if you really wanted to gain control of an area, you had to show respect to the local culture, and you had to take on some of the attributes of the ruling class. And so he essentially embraced the idea of being Pharaoh. And this is a depiction of Alexander as Pharaoh. And this was his men were very nervous about this, because, you know, they knew Alexander as, you know, a leader, but just another man, not a god king. And so when he conquered Egypt, he became the god king of Egypt. And when he conquered Persia, he became the god king of Persia. But his genius was in knowing that if you blend the cultures, you're much more able to administer the area. And for example, he ordered many thousands of his men to marry Persian women so that they could make this blend. Here's an Egyptian hieroglyph with Alexander's name. We're going to go through that. And this is a famous, anybody been to Pompeii? This is a mosaic that was in a house in Pompeii. This is a battle between Alexander and Darius, and it's now in a museum in Naples, and they have a copy in Pompeii. But here's the famous depiction of Alexander. All right, so he creates this tremendous empire, and it immediately breaks up as soon as he dies. And so you have the Ptolemies here controlling Egypt, and at this time, part of all of Judea and part of Lebanon. Then you had the Seleucids, who go all the way from Afghanistan into Syria. And it was one of the Seleucids that the Maccabees rebelled against to drive them out and get a free country again, briefly. All right. So what about the foundation of Alexandria? This is a depiction of, of the founding, from the Renaissance. And the story goes, Plutarch tells the story that Alexander, when he was in Egypt, had a dream about Homer. And Homer had described this island called Pharaohs, which we'll get into. And Alexander decided to found the city, his new city, including this island of Pharaohs. Now, whether this is true or not, the fact is it was a very smart position to pick because it controlled the delta of the Nile. And now here's a picture of the city. Here's the island of Pharaohs. And the first thing that was done, a mole, essentially a bridge, was built to connect Pharaohs with the city itself. And underneath the mole, they put in an aqueduct to supply the water. Now, there was a canal that connected the city with the Nile, one of the branches of the Nile. So there was no problem with enough water. And then ultimately, the harbor was delimited by building walls. This is where the lighthouse was. And then the other wall, was here. Now, Alexander actually designed the city. I mean, he worked out the grid of the city with a Greek architect. That's how much he cared about this. He wanted this to be a premier city of the world. And so they were very wide major streets going north, south, east, west. And very quickly, Jewish people came in to live in the city. Okay, now why? Well, this clearly was going to be one of the great seaports of the Mediterranean. And this was several hundred years before Caesarea. So the Jews were involved in trade. The Jews were already spread around the Mediterranean. This is well before, the destruction of the temple. So about 1/3 of the population was Jewish, which is, it was one of the largest Jewish, at the height of the city, there were 100,000 people in the city, the ancient city, and 30,000, 35,000 of them were Jews. All right, now, then within the city, various buildings were created, and we'll get into that, in a second. Here's the whole Ptolemaic Empire, and if you notice, in the time of Cleopatra, Israel, Judea is free. It's this independent country, and Herod was the king. So they were contemporaries, as we said last lecture. And here's Alexandria. This is the delta of the Nile. And before this, the major cities of Egypt were along the Nile. So it was inward looking. Creating this master harbor added an outward looking perspective as well. It's not as though the Egyptians didn't trade and all the rest and weren't a maritime power. They were, but they didn't have anything approaching this harbor of Alexandria before, the Ptolemies. Here's a picture of what the city may have looked like. These wide streets, they were the widest streets in any Greek city. They were 30 feet wide. They on each side of the center, 60 feet. Underneath them were canals that fed the city. And because this city was designed essentially de novo, it has a beautiful symmetry to it that most other cities in the Mediterranean don't have, that were built one age after another. This was designed, largely in one fell swoop. Now here's there's two harbors. There's this harbor that is essentially protected by walls that were built, and then there was another more open harbor. And here's the lighthouse. Now, it's 360 feet tall. The only thing larger in the world at that time was the Pyramid of Giza, which was 460 feet. This was a massive building, and could be seen miles and miles out to sea. Now, Herod, in some ways, tried to copy or rival Alexandria, but this was a larger harbor and a bigger city than Caesarea. The city was destroyed, this part of the city was destroyed by earthquakes, and we'll get into that in a bit when we talk about maritime archaeology. Here's another picture of it. The first level was essentially rectangular, and then there was octagon, and then a small tower with a statue on top. Inside it were a series of ramps so that you could bring up the material that was needed to illuminate the lighthouse. This is a picture of her palace of Cleopatra. She built 3 of them. I mean, it's just enormous and gorgeous. Again, it was a city to show how powerful Egypt was and how powerful she was. This is a picture of her from the palace looking out at the lighthouse. All right, so what was in the city? A critical area of the city was called the Mosaic, and it's right in this area here. Okay, here's the harbor, here's the lighthouse. Okay, So it's right near the harbor. And the Museion was set up by the early Ptolemies, essentially to be the first research institute in the world. The government subsidized the study of scholars of all sorts, philosophers, people into the natural sciences, astronomers, you name it. They lived there, they were fed, and then other scholars also visited and were housed there and were fed and supported. This is unprecedented in the ancient world. And as a result, the fluorescence of discoveries and work was incredible. And I'll just go over a little bit of it. And it had lecture halls, it had a garden, it had a zoo, so that if you wanted to study animals of various sorts, it was just an amazing creation. There were more than 1,000 scholars who visited the Museion at any given time. And here's a recreation of it. You know, this is not the main library. This is just, you know, some essentially what you would do is if you were visiting, okay, and you were staying in the Museion, you wanted to borrow some of the scrolls from the main library, they would have a place for them to be stored. Now, we don't really know what the library looked like, unfortunately, and there's various artists that have tried to depict it. But we know that it, at its height, had 700,000 scrolls, most of them of papyrus. And how did they get them? Well, first of all, they sent out people to buy them. But the other thing they did is any ship that docked in the city would be searched. And if it had any kind of scroll, it was taken, it was copied, and the library kept the original and gave you the copy. So this was continued all through the Ptolemaic period and was the largest reserve. Now, there were other libraries in the ancient world, but they were selective. You know, they were particular areas of interest. This library collected everything, whether it was thought to, whether the philosopher was thought to be out of date or not. Everything was kept so that scholars could use them if they wanted. Here's another picture of the library. Now, if you saw the movie Cleopatra, you remember that when Caesar was trying to protect her and was attacked by Cleopatra's brother and sister with their army, ships were burned in the harbor, and ultimately the library caught on fire. So we know that at least partially some of the scrolls were destroyed. It wasn't completely destroyed, and they tried to, as much as they could, repair it. Later on, there were other problems. When the Romans took over, they didn't want to support it with their money, so it degenerated. And in the 5th century, when Christian leaders decided they didn't want any non-Christian books, they ended up destroying most of what was left. So the estimates are that we have only 1% of the documents that were stored in the library that came down through history. We know of others because they were mentioned, you know, 3-volume history by a Babylonian, et cetera, but they're gone. We don't have them. And it's really a shame. Now, this city had all of the accoutrements of any Greek city, including an agora, which was, you know, the market area, as well as people gave public speeches there, et cetera, et cetera. So what was daily life like in the city? Well, the Greeks were at the top of the the pyramid, so to speak. They were full citizens. Jews enjoyed most of the rights of citizens, and actually Egyptians had fewer rights than the Jews. I'm not sure exactly why, but that's the way it was structured. The canals brought water in. Egypt was the granary to the Mediterranean world, and this was right through the Roman times. And so that was one of the foods that was consumed and traded: fruits, vegetables, fish, etc. We know the trade, was throughout the Mediterranean world. The language was Greek, and that includes the Jews. The Jews spoke Greek, and one of the reasons why the Torah was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, was because, and this was done in the Mosaic, it was because a lot of the Jews couldn't read Hebrew well enough to read the Torah. So they wanted a translation of it in Greek. Now, as I said before, some of the best minds in the world either lived in Alexandria or they came to study in Alexandria. And just a couple of examples: Archimedes, the great mathematician; Eratosthenes, who was a philosopher and geographer, who calculated the correct circumference of the Earth within 400 miles. So in other words, it's 25,000 miles. He was within 400 miles of the correct number. Now, if you remember with Columbus, a lot of people in Europe did not want to sail west. It was not because they thought the Earth was flat. It was because they believed in the circumference that was calculated by Eratosthenes. And they knew that if there was, water between Europe and Asia, it was too long a trip for any of their boats. Columbus had an erroneous idea. Okay, he didn't agree with the estimate of Eratosthenes, and so it was pure luck on his part that North America and South America were there. Otherwise, it would have been a disaster. And this period of time, not only did they have the correct circumference, another scientist was clear that the Earth rotated around the sun, so which it only was rediscovered with Copernicus. So you had Euclidean geometry, with Euclid, and you had an inventor named Heron, who invented the first vending machine, the first force pump, the first theater with automated figures who danced, and he also designed automatic doors for the temples. I mean, they were really interesting group of people, and it was a very fertile environment. Now, how do we know what we know about Alexandria, other than whatever discussions we have from people like Plutarch or whatever? And that's maritime as well as land archaeology. But the maritime archaeology is a really recent and interesting story. When the earthquakes occurred and the buildings, including the tower, fell into the Mediterranean, okay, people did not look in the water until the 1980s to see what was there. And sure enough, lots of the lighthouse and other parts of palaces and sculptures and all kinds of stuff are sitting in the harbor of Alexandria. Now, the Egyptians don't have the money to house all of these things. So what they do is they bring it up, they study it, and they put them back in the water. And eventually they'll pull all of these things out, but it's just a massive amount of stuff. And here's a sculpture, a priest holding an Osiris jar. Gives you an idea of what the team, the scuba divers looking at a find of a Sphinx. Now, this is 3,000 years old. The reason why it's 3,000 years is that many times monarchs would bring in very old things into their city. So in other words, this Sphinx was made by, was already, several hundred or whatever years old, 1,000 years old in the time of Cleopatra. But she brought it in. She brought obelisks and whatever in her city. This is a sculpture of Cleopatra. Just a bit about her and her. First of all, all the movies show this gorgeous woman. Okay, it's unlikely from what we know about her description of her that she was this beautiful woman. She was a very intelligent woman who was superbly educated, and she was sexy. But if you look at her depictions on statues and on coins, she's not Elizabeth Taylor. This is a sculpture of her son, Caesarion, who is the son of Caesar. And this showing you that how they take it out of the water to study, and then they put it back down. Essentially, big. These are granite columns thought to be from her palace. And this is a sculpture of a god. Now, one of the things that Alexander and his other successors did is they tried to marry Greek religion with Egyptian religion. And this is a composite god, taking an Egyptian god and a Greek god and sort of putting them together. And this became the major god of Alexandria, Serapis. Here's some more. This was thought to be in the lighthouse, this sculpture. All right, well, I given you some idea of Cleopatra. Now here's a very flattering sculpture. Here's a coin, and this is thought to be more like what she looked, more like what she actually appeared to be. Rather large nose and, not these very refined features. But that didn't stop her from seducing Caesar and Mark Antony. And this is a depiction of her as the Pharaoh. She was the only Ptolemy that learned to speak Egyptian. So she had multi languages. She spoke Latin, Greek, and she spoke the Egyptian language. Remember, this is well before Arabic. No Arabs yet here. This is her. The story is that to get into the palace to visit Caesar when he first got there, she had to get beyond the guards of her brother and sister. And the story is that she was brought in wrapped in a carpet and then unrolled before Caesar. And this depicts her first meeting with Mark Antony. Here's a sculpture from the Roman times of Julius Caesar and her. Here's Mark Antony, looks like a surfer boy from California. He was supposed to be a real good-looking guy who just became so besotted with her. When Caesar was assassinated, essentially the empire became divided between Octavian, who became Augustus, and Mark Antony. He had the eastern part, which included Egypt, and Octavian had the west. Well, he wanted to spend so much time with Cleopatra that he neglected a lot of his part of the empire. When it came to a knockdown, drag out with Octavian, he lost. It's another depiction of Cleopatra from the 19th century. And this is a depiction of her death, where supposedly after learning that Mark Antony had committed suicide after the defeat to Octavian, she took a poisonous snake to her breast. Probably not true. She probably just swallowed poison. But all right, what about the Jews? I pointed out the Jewish quarter. That now this was not a quarter where the Jews had to live. They were actually all over the city, and we know that because there were synagogues. There were 12 synagogues. So they were all over the city. But there was an area where there was a concentration of Jews. Now, as I said, they spoke Greek. They were allowed to be governed by their own law within their community as long as it didn't involve a non-Jew. In other words, if it involved a non-Jew, then it was Ptolemaic law. But if it was within the community, they did their own thing. And if you remember, well, we'll get into it when we talk about more Spain. But anyway, and then there was a leader, an ethnarch, who was the leader of the community. Now, they were educated like the Greek elite. So you would find them in the medical school, in the Mosaic. You would find them, in all of the pursuits. And in some ways, they were much more cosmopolitan than the Jews that were living in Judea, and much more tolerant also. Okay.
Hi, sweetie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine.
I'm on mute.
Now, the writings of Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics are extremely, popular in their education as well as in the education of others. And as we'll see a little bit in a few minutes, Philo was the first Jewish philosopher who tried to harmonize Greek culture and Judaism. What were their occupations? I mean, they could basically be whatever they want, but many of them were wealthy merchants, and they were attracted to the city when they realized it was going to be a major port. And there were bankers that were Jewish. There were also soldiers. One source said that there were 30,000 Jews in the army of the Ptolemaic Pharaohs. And some of those Jews rose to the rank of general. So, okay. So why don't we consider Philo now? He lived between 25 BCE and 50 CE. And I said that he was the first Jewish philosopher who attempted to harmonize Greek culture. Obviously, Hellenistic culture had penetrated into Judea. They were occupied by the Seleucids, and the whole Maccabee rebellion was about resentment of Hellenistic trends that were occurring in the country, and the Maccabees were against it. But there was no such antipathy among the Jews of Alexandria. So let's look and discuss some of the things that Philo wrote. God and no mortal is my sovereign. Okay, so he's firmly basing himself in the Torah. Okay, so that he shouldn't be misunderstood. He who has God alone for his leader, he alone is free. But then we get into things that are more, more reminiscent of Greek thought. Learning, and we're talking about learning of every subject, not just learning of Torah, but learning of all across the board, is by nature curiosity, prying into everything, reluctant to leave anything material or immaterial unexplained. Now, who does this remind you of? What later Jewish philosopher does this remind you of? This sense of, learning, the Greek corpus and any other kinds of knowledge and trying to integrate that into your worldview.
Maimonides?
Yeah, Maimonides. And in a way, Maimonides is struggling with the same issues as Philo, and he's doing it at another time when Greek and Roman knowledge flourishes, and that is under the aegis of the Muslims. And we'll see that in the next 3 lectures when we talk about Cordoba, Fez, and Cairo. So from this point on, first for Judaism and then for Christianity, the problem is, how do you deal with rational thought and knowledge coming from rational thought, even though you want to be a Jew? I mean, is this a problem, and how do you deal with it? Any observations about that? I mean, do you think that this issue is still alive in Judaism today? Science versus religion. Well, just look at the Orthodox, right? I mean, their point of view is that if science in a way contradicts the Torah, then you reject the science. So, I mean, there still is this tension, you know, what's the nature of God and whatever. All right. Nothing will a man rue more than refusal to listen to the wise, spoken like a true philosopher, right? Listen to me. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. So we're all in the same boat. Nature has born and reared all men alike and created them genuine brothers, not in mere name, but in the very reality. Though this kinship has been put to confusion by the triumph of malignant covetousness, which has wrought estrangement instead of affinity and enmity instead of friendship. So essentially here, you know, we miss the fact that we're all brothers and sisters because we covet things. That's certainly true today, absolutely. So he's again, you know, struggling with the idea that your aspirations for material things has to be tempered by a sense of affinity to other people and your role as a human being. Those who give hoping to be rewarded with honor are not giving, they are bargaining. Who does that sound like?
We're not going to get political.
Well, it's Maimonides.
Okay.
Remember, Maimonides said that, you know, the best kind of giving is anonymous.
No.
You shouldn't be looking for something if you're going to give. The body is the soul's house. Shouldn't we therefore take care of our house so that it doesn't fall into ruin? Now, Maimonides said that the body, okay, should be taken care of, because how are you going to be able to learn Torah if you don't take care of your body? And, you know, the role of Jews in medicine goes way back into this period. All right. We don't obviously have pictures of the Jewish community in the time of Cleopatra. But in many ways, the community has always looked like the people that they've lived with. In other words, if you looked at the Jews that lived in Alexandria, it would be hard for you to pick them out from the Greeks. And if you here are the Jews that lived in Muslim Alexandria, and they look like the Egyptians, right? You really can't tell them apart. And this community existed from the beginning of the creation of the city up until 1948 with the founding of Israel, and then most of the Jews of Alexandria left. Now, the Egyptian government is keeping up some of these synagogues at their own expense because it's great for tourism. So here's one of the main synagogues. This was a 14th century building built on top of an earlier building. And the Egyptian government spent $2 million updating it. Here's a picture again from the 19th century, early 20th century of a Bat Mitzvah in Alexandria. Here's an interior shot of the synagogue from the ladies' floor. So you can't see much of the ancient Jewish city in Alexandria, just hints. But we know that every time they dig in Alexandria, just about they find something of the ancient city. It's just sitting there underneath all the buildings. So maybe we'll get some more in the future. All right, any questions or comments?
No, but I'd like to apologize to the people that came late. We know we didn't get the notice out. And then the participants list, when they're screen sharing, I didn't have the participants list, so I didn't see people were waiting in the waiting room. So I've learned something today about screen sharing and letting in people. So next time that won't happen again.
Well, how many people didn't have the screen share?
Well, there was about 4 or 5 there were 4 that were waiting in the waiting room, and all of a sudden I got a little notice, that the participants list, So they came in late, but a reminder to everybody that this will be on YouTube tomorrow, according to Les, and you can see the beginning of it then. But let's see now, at this point, I think we have 10 people here now. When we first, so there were 5 people in the waiting room. So they came in about 20 after, I think it was, or 25 after. So I've learned that.
I think we actually have 13, because you count Les and Bev, David, Martha, Lenny, and Dusty.
No, there's 10 screens up, Les and Bev, so that would be 11. But there's 10 people who actually got on. Michael, Lenny, the Walperts, Lynn came in late, I think. They were the ones that were in the waiting room that I didn't know how to get the participants list up. But now I do. Anyway, we're getting more organized each week.
I wanted to make a comment about, could you go back to the picture of the Bat Mitzvah?
Yes. Yeah, how did we have bat mitzvahs? That was
Right there. Yeah, so I'm interested because I understood the first Bat Mitzvah was in like the 30s.
Right.
Mordecai Kaplan's daughter.
Yeah.
So I'm interested what the date of this is and when they would have started.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to look it up.
Do you know where you got this picture?
It's got to be before 1948.
So it would have been right after. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there was like a tradition of Bat Mitzvah before Mordecai Kaplan introduced it.
I'll look it up.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And they certainly don't dress like that now at bat mitzvahs. They're so cute.
Yeah. Are we sure it's Bat Mitzvah rather than something else, some other?
That was the caption on the picture. So yeah, I mean, I will look for it though. Okay. No questions, so
Yes. Now, I just want to say to everybody, save the message from today and put it on your calendar now that on June 30th, we'll be here again and it's the same login. And
Also, Ricky, what we're going to try to do is between Jane and Stacy and me, we'll get a reminder out to everybody early in the week of the 30th.
Yeah, exactly. And come 5-10 minutes early because we chit chat.
So what's the subject next week? I mean, next time?
the two is Cordoba.
Cordoba.
Cordoba and the golden age of Muslim Spain. Oh, you're going to get into Donna Grazia? She
Pardon
was
me?
fascinating. Donna Grazia was Muslim Spain and left and ended up basically founding Tiberias. Maybe not.
I didn't understand. Who is the person?
Oh, I said it twice. Her last name was Garcia.
Donna Grazia.
Donna Grazia, right. Fascinating woman.
Okay. All right. See you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, David.
All right.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.